definition, but a lot of folks are unhappy with it. So we're still in the point, the field is only 40 years old. The big push that I make now in my lectures is talking about the fact that we need to make a paradigm shift in special education in terms of these kids and regular education. We need to change one word when we deal with these kids, and the word is a verb. We need to change the verb is to the verb has. It's not that the child is a problem, the child has a problem. Many teachers view that this kid is a problem. He holds my class back. He takes too long. He needs modifications. He is a problem. We need to recognize he has a problem. And if you can make that paradigm shift, it's going to completely change the way you focus on that child. And that's, I believe, what the F.A.T City Workshop does, is it makes that paradigm shift. The child is not trying to be difficult. It's not his fault. It certainly isn't his choice. I've never worked with a child with a learning disability who wouldn't give up anything to not have that disability. They're not doing it. It's no choice of their own. It's no fault of their own. They have a problem. It's not that they are a problem. And F.A.T City begins to move people in that direction. I think the biggest change in our field, and the most positive change in our field, is a recognition of what we refer to as the pervasive nature of learning disabilities. And that is that we realize now that the neurological problems that are causing this child difficulty in school are also going to cause difficulty at home, on the playing field, at grandma's house on weekends. Learning disabilities is not a school problem. It's a life, language, and learning problem. The example I use of that is the skill of revisualization. You use the skill of revisualization in order to spell. If I were to ask you to spell the word America for me, you would use a skill of revisualization. You'd picture the word America in your mind and call off the letters. You picture that. That's why sometimes you can pick up a flyer from the supermarket and the headline says cantaloupes $1.25, and you look at that and you say, that's spelled wrong. And somebody says, how do you spell it? And you say, I don't know, but I know that's wrong. Because you can picture what cantaloupe should look like in your mind, and that word doesn't look like the word you pictured. You use the skill of revisualization in order to spell. Many of our kids can't revisualize, therefore they can't spell. But speaking to the pervasive nature of the problem, the child who can't revisualize because he can't spell because he can't revisualize will also have difficulty keeping his room clean at home. Because you also use a skill of revisualization when you clean a room at home. You have guests for dinner, your guests leave, you walk into the kitchen is a mess. Pots and pans, dirty dishes. What you do is you revisualize the kitchen clean and then do things to the kitchen until it matches that picture you've got in your mind. That's how you wash a car on a Saturday morning. You look at the dirty car, picture it clean, and do things to it till it matches that picture. The child with learning disabilities who can't revisualize in his fourth period English class doesn't suddenly develop the skill of revisualization when he goes home. It literally is 24/7, and it literally is womb to tomb. It will never be cured. I'm not a doctor, but I've spoken to many neurologists who will back me up on this. The neurological system in the body is the only system in the body that cannot repair itself once it's been damaged. Once the damage has been done, it can't be fixed. Now, your neurological system can switch and use different parts of the brain, but the idea that someone will say, I had a learning disability as a child, but I don't anymore. Well, then you were either you're kidding yourself and you still do, or you were misdiagnosed as a child, because if you had it as a child, you will always have it. If you have a 6-year-old child with a learning disability, in 10 years he'll be a 16-year-old adolescent with learning disability, and in 20 years he'll be a 26-year-old adult with a learning disability. It doesn't go away. And what you find is that these kids have to continue in adult life to work twice as hard to get half as far. We realize now that the ultimate, and this is difficult for me to admit as an educator, but the ultimate success of these kids when they become adults will be determined by their social skills, not by their academic skills. We spend so many hours in school trying to teach kids academic skills, and we should, but we know the research, I won't even argue this with anyone anymore, the research is so clear, whether or not they make it as adults will be determined by their social skills. And what we find is that their social skills are often very sadly lacking. Not because they're not nice people, not because they're rude people in any way, although they act that way many times, they just don't get it. Their neurological problems prevent them from understanding social environments. I'm not talking about which fish fork to use and that kind of thing. I'm talking about the ability to interact, to begin a conversation, how to end a conversation, how to introduce yourself to people, how to break into a group, how to leave a group. Those kinds of things we find are sadly lacking in our kids, and we need to emphasize that much more in schools. The biggest change that we've seen has been a legislative one. There are now laws that impact on the placement of special needs children and children with learning disabilities. Unfortunately, despite all the work that's been done by wonderful organizations like PBS and the National Center for Learning Disabilities, Learning Disabilities Association, and those kinds of organizations, we find that there are still many people, maybe the majority of people in the United States, who automatically acquaint learning disabilities with some sort of a mental impairment, and it has nothing to do with mental impairment. The landscape is getting better. It's frustrating, frankly, because there is federal law, and I will go to a school system, and not only do I find differences in the quality of services from one school system to another school system, and from one city to another city, I find differences in services between one school within a school system and the school across the street. And much of it has to do, frankly, with leadership. I do a lot of work with principals and assistant principals in schools. The reality is, if the leader in that school, if the principal or the vice principal of the school does not accept and understand the interaction between learning disabilities and regular education, it's not going to work. I was called in to consult at a school system. There were two middle schools that were at opposite ends of town. They were as similar as two schools could be. One school, they had the same basic tenure of staff, the same experience of staff, the same budgets. Everything was basically the same, except inclusion and mainstreaming was working beautifully in one school and not in the other school. So they said, we'll pay you for a week to come in and take a look at these two schools and see what the problem is. I went to visit both schools on Monday morning, and I called the superintendent at lunch, and I said, let's have lunch, I'm done. And he said, you got a week? I said, no. I said, I'm ready to talk to you now. I said, I walked the halls. The difference was the principal. The principal in one school said, basically, you know, they've stuck us with some more of these special kids, and let's do what we can, but don't worry too much about it. There's really no accountability. Let's try to muddle through and just try to survive this experience. The principal at the other school, where inclusion was working, basically said, these kids are with me. I've committed to these parents that's going to work for these kids, and I'll be there for you to give any help I can as your leader, but I'm going to expect that these kids are going to make it. That was the only difference. The principal, the school leader, is so important. They did a wonderful piece of research one time on school principals, and I love the quote they used in their report. They said, we found some bad schools with a good principal. In other words, a school that was having real trouble, but there was a good principal in there trying to make it better. We found some bad schools with a good principal, but we found no good schools with a bad principal. Anxiety is becoming a huge issue now in dealing with children with learning disabilities. What we find is many of our children, some people say the majority of children with learning disabilities, have undiagnosed anxiety problems. And people confuse anxiety and depression. People tend to use the terms interchangeably when actually they're quite different, particularly with children. Depressed people worry about the past. If you know somebody who's in a depression, he's focusing on a loss that he suffered. Depressed people worry about the past. Anxious people worry about the future. And many, many of our children, as again, some research says the majority of special needs children, children with learning disabilities, have severe anxiety disorders, where the teacher will say, next week we're going to go on a field trip to the zoo. That's enough to trigger an anxiety. You know, can I sit near a window? What if it rains? Are we still going to go? How much money should I bring? And they occupy so much of their time and energy worrying about things that are never going to happen. And that's one of the things I spoke earlier about comorbidity and multi-handicap. What we're finding is many of our kids have anxiety problems that are every bit as severe as their learning problems. One of the things we talk about in the video, at one point during the video, I talk about teachers taking great pride in dragging kids through a curriculum that's really above their head. That's become particularly problematic now with high-stakes testing. The high-stakes testing movement in our country is extraordinarily damaging in special education, and it's because the high-stakes testing movement was designed without thinking about special needs kids. I think it's going to follow the pattern of, in 1960, they used to build a building and then say, okay, how do we make it handicapped accessible? You know, after the building was built, how do we make it accessible to people with handicapping conditions? Now, when you build a building, one of your first thoughts is it going to be handicapped accessible? And I think the high-stakes testing movement was begun without thinking about special needs kids, how they fit into this. And you've got kids who can't read sitting in front of a test for 4 hours that they literally can't read. The the biggest problem we're having now, or the biggest issue we're having now in schools, is the idea of remedial versus compensatory education. And what that means is this. If you've got a child in your school and he's functioning at he's in the seventh grade, he's in grade 7, but he's functioning at the 4th grade level. You've got a gap there, and you want to close that gap. And there's 2 ways you can do it. One is remedial. Remedial education says, kid, you're in the 7th grade, but you're functioning at the 4th grade level. And I'm going to try to improve your skills. I'm going to make you a better reader, writer, and speller. I'm going to take your 4th grade skills and bring them up to 7th grade level. I'm going to remediate your problem. I'm going to bridge that gap by improving your skills and bring them up to 7th grade level. That's remedial education, and that's good. The other approach is compensatory education. Compensatory is different. Compensatory says, kid, you're in the 7th grade, but you're functioning at the 4th grade level. And I'm going to close that gap, but here's how I'm going to do it. I'm not going to try to make you a better reader, writer, and speller. I'm going to bring the curriculum down to you. I'm going to close that gap by bringing the 7th grade curriculum down to you. I'm going to put the book on tape. I'm going to modify the curriculum. I'm going to adjust the testing and bring it down to you. That's compensatory education, and that's good too. But the problem in schools now is we're doing so much compensatory education that no one's doing any remediating anymore. No one's trying to fix the problem. And I'll go into a school and I'll say to the principal, how are you doing in special ed in your school? And he says, we're doing really well. In fact, we took all of the history books and put the history books on tape. So now the child with a learning disability can go and take out the tape rather than take out the book. We're done. We're fine here. Well, that principal's forgetting something very important, and that is this. The problem is not that the child can't read the history book. The problem is the child can't read. And putting the book on tape is not dealing with the problem. It's only dealing with the symptom of the problem. He can't read. Symptomatic of that, he can't read the history book. So you put the history book on tape, he still can't read. And our headlong rush into compensatory education, where all we're doing is compensating for the child's problem, but no one's doing any remediating. And what we're doing is asking special ed teachers, instead of the special ed teacher trying to fix the problem or remediate, we're saying to the special ed teacher, help him study for his history test, help him memorize this list of words for science class. And what we're finding is we're turning our special ed teachers into compensatory teachers, and no one's trying to fix the problem. And I think it's a huge problem, probably the biggest problem we have in special education right now, that we're focusing on the child's strengths and we're not putting enough focus on the child's weaknesses. One of the misconceptions out there, and I still hear it, even though mainstreaming now is 25 years old, is that teachers feel that you'll lower the standards of the school by allowing special needs kids to go to class with regular ed kids. There's not a piece of empirical evidence that shows that's the case. In fact, the evidence shows very clearly that when you bring special needs kids into regular education, it makes the teachers more sensitive and more patient. It makes the kids more tolerant and responsive. It really does improve the school. There's an old New England story, if you can picture the scene of these group of kids waiting to get into school at the beginning of the school day, and there'd been a surprise snowstorm. And so the janitor is shoveling off the front steps, and the kids are waiting to get up the steps to get into school. And there's a little boy in a wheelchair. And he says to the janitor, will you shovel off the ramp so I can get in? And the janitor gets a little bit miffed, and he said, well, look, I've got all these kids waiting to use the steps. Once I get the steps shoveled off, I'll shovel the ramp. You're going to have to wait. And the little boy says, if you shovel off the ramp, we can all get in. In other words, if you make this place accessible to me, and you make it responsive to me with my special problems, you're making it more responsive and receptive to everybody. If you shovel off the ramp, we can all get in. And that's a story I use with the mainstream teachers, because they said, no, they're going to lower the standards in our classes. Our classes won't be able to move it. No, it actually makes you a better teacher, because these kids you need to teach these kids. They don't just learn. You need to teach. I had a teacher say to me one time, I taught it to him, but he didn't learn it. I said, that's like a salesman saying to his boss, I sold it to him, but he didn't buy it. I mean, the child didn't learn it. You didn't teach it. That's the bottom line. And it does make you a better teacher. Harvard University did a mammoth study recently, and there is an over-identification of minority children in special ed populations. Now, the way they figure that out is to say what's the percentage of a certain minority in this community, and if it's 8%, you should see 8% in special education. They find it's 8% of the community and 25% of the population in special education classes. There is interestingly enough, at least to the best of my knowledge, there doesn't appear to be an overrepresentation in classes for children with learning disabilities, for African American children or for Hispanic children. But there is a great overrepresentation in classes for children with behavioral problems and children with a retardation of some sort, a mental impairment. You see a great overrepresentation of minorities in those populations. Unfortunately, the studies indicate that not only are more minorities placed in special education, but they don't benefit as much from special education, and the special education they're given is not as good. So it is a tremendous problem. What people have tried to do is to tease out why we see more minorities in special populations. You know, is it parenting skills? Is it poverty? Is it nutrition? Is it teacher training? Is it the quality of the schools? I find some frustration with that because I think it's all of the above, that they're never going to find the one identifying factor that makes this overrepresentation. I think it's a combination of all those things, and so we need to work on all those things and improving the quality of schools in minority areas, improving parent and teacher education in those areas. Parent education is extraordinarily important. Many times you find that the mom or dad were in special class themselves, or the family was begun when mom and dad were 18 or 19 years old. They have no training in parenting, and the programs that are working for minority children with special needs are programs that do a lot of work in teacher training, a lot of work on school improvement, and an awful lot of work on parent training as well. There was a lot of talk about the fact that the testing that we use with these kids is culturally biased. And that's one more thing in the mix. I don't think that's the reason that we see, although there is bias in the testing. You know, one of the tests talks about something that goes on in a living room. Well, you know, if you're in a Native American family who lives on a reservation, you don't know what a living room is, and so you're more likely to get that question wrong. There is cultural bias within those tests, but I don't think that's the primary reason either. I think it really is a mix of those problems. I was doing some work with a university in the Midwest who works with homeless learning disabled children. Now imagine that double whammy of being homeless and having a learning problem. And what we're finding is that many of these families are migrant farm families who move from school district to school district, basically following the crops. And a child will go to a school district, they're picking grapes in Napa Valley, and the child enters a school district there, and some good soul tests the child, realizes he's got a learning disability, and begins to work with him, and then comes to school one day and the child's no longer there. They've moved on to Idaho to pick potatoes, and so some school has to begin all over with that child. And so there's in those minority populations, the homeless and African American, Hispanic populations, the Asian populations, we're seeing a very, very different challenge. There's a great underrepresentation of Asians in special education. So the fact that we will ever get that balance, I don't think we should try to get that balance, because I think there'll always be an overrepresentation because of this mix of problems that these folks face. We need to understand that special education is a science and an art. The art part of it is going well. Again, I think we're sensitizing people to learning problems more. I think the teachers have stopped fighting the fact that these kids are in their classes and are taking that energy and investing it in learning more. So the art part of it is going well. The real work needs to be done in the science area. We're learning so much more. I talked in the video about distractibility as a big part of attention deficit disorder. Well, again, that was 2 decades ago. We realize now that distractibility and impulsivity that we thought was what ADD was all about is literally the tip of the iceberg. That the distractibility and impulsivity that used to characterize, that used to be the definition of learning disabilities, we realize is the tip of the iceberg. These kids have tremendous difficulty with what are called temporal relationships. They don't understand time. We're realizing now that it's those kinds of problems that are impacting on these kids much more than just the hyperactivity. In fact, we find that many kids have attention deficit without hyperactivity. In fact, we're seeing that much more commonly among girls, that they don't act out and they don't misbehave, and so they often don't get diagnosed, but they have an attention deficit disorder that's every bit as bad as the boy next to her who's being treated for attention deficit disorder. So where we need to really work is on the science of it, learning more in the laboratories, and then taking that science and translating it to the teachers. There is a great disconnect between what's going on in the universities and what's happening in schools. Unfortunately, in our in our field today, there are many what I term questionable practices that are used. We tend to do the same thing over and over and over again, even if it's not working. I had a teacher say to me one time, I've kept this kid in for recess for 15 days in a row and he still isn't doing his math homework. Well, circle the slow learner in this picture, okay? It's not working. If you kept him in for recess 15 days in a row and it hasn't changed his behavior, then try something else. We need to fix that disconnect where the universities are doing this great research, we're learning more about these kids, but it's just not filtering into the classroom. We don't have a vehicle for that in education. Doctors do. They've got their journals, they've got their advanced training where some surgeon in Chicago comes up with a new technique and within 6 months every, a surgeon in East Overshoe, Kansas knows how to do it. That everybody, they've got a way to communicate that information. There's no vehicle for that in education, unfortunately. And so, as I said earlier, you go from school to school, from classroom to classroom, and got one teacher teaching with 1960 techniques and the next teacher teaching with techniques from the 21st century. It's very, very troubling. Many times teachers want cookbook solutions. I was recently in New Zealand, and they said we need plasters. We need plasters. Well, I didn't know what a plaster was. It turns out it's a Band-Aid. And what they're saying is we need Band-Aids. We need ways to fix this problem day to day. There are no Band-Aids to fix this problem day to day. And a technique that might be very effective with one child is going to be ineffective with another child. It's a very generic disability, and we're beginning to understand that now. That not only are children with learning disabilities different from the general population, they're also very different one from another. The analogy I use is the table of elements in chemistry has 115 elements on it, and you can combine them to make an almost infinite variety of combinations that are different kinds of chemical compounds. Same way with learning disabilities. There's about 115 different symptoms that kids can have, and each kid is a different combination of those symptoms. And yet you go into schools and they say, this is the reading technique we use for all of our learning disabled kids. This is the spelling technique we use for all of our kids with learning problems. And it just isn't the case. It needs to be different strokes for different folks. One of the troubling things for me as well is the technology. Technology has a place in the lives of our kids. It truly does. It's a very valuable tool. But what I see is school systems buying computers and firing teachers, thinking that the software and the technology is going to be the answer for these kids. There is never going to be an answer. There will never be one answer. And I think we're investing more time, energy, and resources than we should in trying to find the technology that's going to turn the corner in this. Because, when I was running a school, if I had an extra $35,000, I was more likely to hire another teacher than to buy a computer. They have their place. They are a very, very valuable tool, but I think their value is being greatly overstated right now. One of the unfortunate things in our field is, frankly, a cottage industry that's cropped up of what we refer to as questionable practices or controversial therapies. Their parents, kids go to school for a living, that's their job. And if they're failing at their job, oftentimes it manifests itself at home by either becoming very withdrawn or acting out. So parents see their child in desperate trouble. And when you're desperate, many times you'll make foolish and rash decisions. And what we find is many parents go through a period we call flight, where they try to find simple answers. And unfortunately, there's a cottage industry of simple answers that have cropped up in our country, where these special glasses will make learning disabilities go away. This special tape that the child listens to at night will make it go away. There's a gentleman that says if you rub cod liver oil in a child's stomach and put him under a sun lamp, it makes a learning disability go away. And some of those things sound almost laughable. But when you're a parent who's watching your child struggle every day and come home from school crying every day, nobody would sit with him on the school bus, and he got hollered at by his teacher, and the principal made him stay in for recess, you will try almost anything to make that go away. And many times parents fall victim to that. And I think we need to do a lot more in terms of focusing on those practices and educating parents and teachers to the things that do work and the things that don't. So there are new methods and materials coming out, but everybody continues to look for the magic pill, the magic bullet that's going to be the answer. There's not going to be any set answer, because if you're dealing with 25 children with learning disabilities, there are 25 different sets of answers. Parents and teachers need to work together. The parent I really believe strongly in loco parentis, that the teacher is the parent for those 6 hours a day, and the parent has the child the other 18 hours a day. And unless they're working in partnership, unless they're working together for the betterment and the common good of the child, it's just not going to work. I found an old African proverb that was so perfect that I made a sign out of it, and it hangs in the conference room. And what it says is this: when elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. When elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. Two great big 2-ton elephants meet in the jungle. They start banging heads. They're so strong and so powerful with that bony structure in the front of their skulls. They bang heads for 2 hours at a time and then just walk away unscathed, ready to fight another day. But in the meantime, they've leveled every shrub, every bush, every piece of vegetation, every blade of grass in the area is trampled and gone forever. And that's the way it is in the lives of kids. If the adults in a kid's life are fighting, it's the kid who gets hurt. Every time I go to a system that is working, that is serving kids, parents and teachers are working well together.